Okay, let's talk about Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth for a few minutes here. Again, just it's kind of some background, kind of why I'm doing this whole series, but also I think it frames some of the central questions surrounding CO2. So there's a really famous part of this movie, like the really dramatic climax of this movie is when Al Gore he gets on a scissor lift and he rolls around and he explains this graph that goes back 400,000 years, and it correlates the dirt tracks to the temperature and the CO2 levels. And the temperatures and the CO2 levels, they rise and they fall in lockstep, where the CO2 levels go from like 180 parts per million up to 300, and they go down again, they go up again. At the very end, they shoot up to 400 parts per million. This is very dramatic. I mean, really, really dramatic. And it looks really scary, and it might be. But what it's not talked about, it doesn't seem like, is that's like a 30% rise in CO2. Now, granted, over a 100-year period or so, that might be a lot, but it might not be. To go from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. Now it is rising, and again, I don't want to minimize this too much, but it just seems like we should be asking ourselves that question. What's interesting about this graph, besides that though, is that if you go back 800,000 years, the CO2 level, it skyrockets, and it hangs out in the thousands for, I think, millions of years. So you're talking the CO2 levels, hanging out at 2,000 or 3,000 parts per million, which made me ask, like, at what level is CO2 toxic to humans? I mean, should we be that scared of it? And according to Google, CO2 isn't toxic to human beings until 60,000 parts per million. I just find that interesting. So you have those two facts. Al Gore also he's confusing correlation and causation. One doesn't mean the other, and you're not going to argue anybody off this ledge, probably, or from their opinion here. So that's another reason why we need to look into this. Al Gore makes the statement very firmly that it's obvious that CO2 is driving the rise in temperature in his movie. So that again is why I think that needs to be addressed, and I think people generally kind of accept that. But anyhow, that hockey stick, it's used as a scare tactic, and he doesn't really address whether or not a 30% rise in CO2 over a century is a big deal, or why it would be a big deal, other than, once again, going back to the greenhouse effect, or very generally saying that CO2 is trapping heat in the atmosphere. So I don't know. Is a 30% rise? Is it huge? It's weird. I don't want to minimize that. It does look very scary, but I think that should be looked into. And in the next video, we will talk about the amount of CO2 and even the idea that we just focus on parts per million. But what does that really communicate to us? It tells us a percentage, and it's a way to kind of simply talk about them. But what is a part? How much out? It depends on what's out there, like how big your container is. So lots of variables to talk about. This is hopefully where things get a little more interesting. But if you haven't seen Al Gore's movie, you should probably go watch it. It's what a lot of people are basing their emotions on, and it was also, I think it was released in 06, 07 or something along those lines. So yeah, it's over 10 years old. Have the predictions come true? Have they not? Do some science.